Thank you so much for having me. I was said I could talk about this for hours because it is a very important topic. It is something that we as a community and honestly as the adults that should be kind of leading this charge need to be able to support our youth in making better decisions. So one of the things that as an addiction psychiatrist that I've seen over the last couple of years is as cannabis has become first decriminalized and then legalized, is that the access to cannabis for younger and younger kids have increased. And what we see on the medical side from this is that we see the effects of cannabis are being more prominently kind of surfacing more prominently in different ways in school settings, in emergency rooms, at home. And so it really does take a measured and collaborative approach between those different settings to make a difference. Just kind of off the cuff to say the things that we see the most as problematic use of cannabis is that we see adolescents that are using it in a way to cope with a negative emotional state when they really don't have the tools to cope otherwise. And so there really does have to be a dual approach in addressing the actual cannabis use, but also the underlying concern that they're having that they're turning to cannabis as a distraction tool. We do see that for a smaller subset of the population, that cannabis really can be incredibly detrimental to their developing brains. We do know medically for any adolescent under the age, I mean, 26 is when the brain stops, but any adolescent in that 14 to 17 range is when the brain is really developing quite quickly. And any cannabis use at that time can be detrimental and really does have an impact. And so being able to start to develop a conversation with our teenagers about what the choices they are making, the implications that that may have, and what those choices may change for them down the line is very important. So I think starting the conversation early. I mean, I'm a parent myself. I have three kids, but I do think some kind of knowing the cadence of when this starts to come up in school, I do think right before they get to middle school, it's incredibly important because the more information they have, the better chance they have to make a more reasoned decision. So the medical implication is huge. The behavioral implication in that they delay their ability to develop coping skills is huge. And then the big piece of it, honestly, I think is being able to deviate from the norm. And I mean that in that for us as a society, we are increasing towards accepting it more. But what we aren't doing is kind of underscoring that caveat that adults are accepting it more, but it still doesn't make it okay for adolescents. And one of the skills that I talk to kids about when I am dealing with a child or an adolescent that really does have a cannabis addiction is besides talking about the cannabis in and of itself and what it does for them and why they're choosing it, also talking about what it's like to be different, what it's like to say no in a group of people saying yes, and how to navigate that dynamic. Because if we don't equip our kids with the ability to address that, it becomes incredibly difficult to say to them, you shouldn't use this, and we're not giving you skills to be the one that feels confident saying no. So I think there are a couple of ways that we can mirror, kind of be able to approximate that and model it for our kids. One of the big things that I start with is talking to parents about it, even though, many parents in my town, and in my community, they smoke pot. But being able to, for the kid, if a kid sees a parent smoking pot, of course they're going to think it's okay for them. How can they see that it's any different? So while I'm not trying to govern what parents do, I do think that we have to be mindful in supporting them that anything they do in front of their kids sends a message that maybe this might be okay for the child too. And so even if explicitly you're saying to them, this could be harmful to you, implicitly you're showing them that, it's okay for mom and dad. So why wouldn't they think that it would be okay for them? I also, I was looking at some of the data from our ER visits from, I guess, over the last couple of years. And although it looks in the epidemiological data as though we're doing better with ER visits, I actually worry that this plays into a little bit more what I was just speaking about, is that parents are more permissive of it. And so kids don't end up in the ER as much because it's kind of like, oh, this isn't such a big deal. It wouldn't necessitate somebody coming and showing up unless there was a real psychiatric concern. Unless the kid got acutely psychotic or was, just really paranoid and acting very different. So although the ED visits look like we might be doing better, I don't know if that should be the inference we make from it. I do think that it's something that we on our campus and honestly in my community and in a lot of my work, I talk about it with everybody because just because we don't ask about it doesn't mean it's not a part of their lives. Cannabis is kind of everywhere right now. And so being able to allow opportunities in a non-judgmental way for teens, adolescents, people that may come into contact with it to be able to have those conversations and ask questions and, be able to have really a back and forth discussion about kind of the risks and why they might think that it's an opportunity for them and develop a conversation around being curious and knowing more, I think is really, really important. Um, for some kids, it really just they don't see the detrimental effect and everybody around them does. And then it becomes a difficult point of contention where they're like, no, this is the only thing that helps me. And we are saying to them, no, you can't do this. And it feels very invalidating to say, I know you think it helps me and you can't have it. So being able to open that conversation early so that you can kind of identify what make an adolescent curious about cannabis. The couple of things that I highlight for adolescents, which seem to resonate a little bit more with them. One is that it is that it impacts the developing brain. And for kids, they want to be the best kind of sharpest that they can. They want to achieve all the things and saying, listen, like any time that you smoke pot, you are decreasing your chances of that level of success that you could attain, allows them to at least give a pause to think about it. But the other thing that I think is actually more important and more they find more relatable is that it actually, cannabis in studies shows that it affects our ability to kind of read the emotions of others and then in turn affects our emotional connectivity. And anybody that's talked to any teenager recently knows that the only thing kids care about at that age is their kind of emotional connectivity to others and the way they fit in the group. And so if they have the information that although it doesn't feel like it at the time and it feels like they're joining with the group, it's actually impairing their ability to develop these deep connections. It's not going to change their behavior in the short term, but if they start to see something meet that pattern, it might validate what you're saying a little bit. So laying the framework such that when something does meet that pattern, they can see it is incredibly important. But as I said, I think that the biggest recommendation I would have as a physician that treats patients that are struggling with cannabis use and the amount I'm seeing in our youth is that it really takes two prongs. We really have to start the kids talking about it early in a safe setting where it's non-judgmental, very curious. We have to teach them how to be the one to say no in the group because that's just as important as actually saying no, is having the strength to say no. And we have to work with the parents to support them in that although they may feel like the choice of smoking pot for them is okay, they have to understand that their actions in front of their kids will dictate their kids' choices later, even if we don't intend for it to. There's a lot of information in a little bit of time, but I want to give you guys some time if anybody has questions or wants to, want some kind of information, specific information. I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so this is the ED visits of all ages. So this is the all ages one, and it does look like we had this huge rise in 2022, 2023 started to come down a little bit, and that it's doing a bit better this year. Although if you're looking, it's the first quarter, so if you multiply it by 4, it does kind of approximate that it would be steady. And we haven't seen some of the holiday times where things get a bit crazy. But if anybody wants to ask questions.
I when I'm like in the community, I get a lot of parents that like compare cannabis use to alcohol use. They feel like it's a better option. They prefer if their child use marijuana versus alcohol. Do you have data on like because my thing is just like yeah, sorry.
I think you're asking about equating cannabis use to alcohol use, right? Yeah. Okay, so 2 things about that. One, cannabis is a psychoactive drug. Cannabis could make anybody psychotic, and the small subset of a population that is predisposed to it, it can actually change their trajectory of their mental health for good. Meaning it could unlock a psychotic illness that lived somewhere in their brain, and it could change the way that their reality is for the rest of their life. Alcohol doesn't do that. So for just by and large, by those 2 differences, cannabis is actually more dangerous for the brain and for those that are genetically predisposed to having psychotic or bipolar illness. Um, so that's one way that I really differentiate them. Alcohol, by and large, has much more mortality and morbidity associated with it, but it's also been in our community legalized for much longer. Um, and its effects are more dramatic with like a dose dependent relationship, meaning that if you have, 2 beers, fine, maybe, but if you have 20 beers, definitely the chances of an adverse event increase. With cannabis, it's not quite like that. So that's why I think people think that it's safer, but the um, effects of cannabis can change the chemistry of your brain forever, whereas the effects of alcohol, unless you are a heavy drinker, don't. So cannabis is actually riskier. Just the way that we publicize and know about the risks is in the norm, kind of non-medical field, it is not, we're just not as literate in those risks.
That, because you talk about, lower IQ and emotional regulation. Can you give us like the 1 minute elevator pitch to a teenager to say, to convince them that cannabis is bad? And I say that very.
So I just had this
up.
conversation. I just had this conversation with a 14-year-old kid on our inpatient unit, because he's like, it's incredible, doc. Like, I'm not leaving it behind. And so first what I do is I fact find. I say, what's important to you? And they'll typically answer to me that they want to either do good in school, sports, or make friends. And so I'll ask permission first. I'll say, may I share with you what role cannabis can play in those goals? And I wait for their permission. They'll say yes. And I'll say, although you don't feel it, what our studies show us is that when teenagers, just in the age range you're in, when their brains are developing, cannabis is the thing that pushes their brain onto a different path. And it will delay your ability to be emotionally connected to others. It may impact your ability to achieve those academic or fitness sports related goals. And it can stop the development of the most successful you that you could have been. The choices you make between 14 and 17 really, in relation to cannabis, can change the course of your life forever. If you can reserve the right to make a reasoned decision when your brain is more fully formed, you can amplify the chances that you could have meet your successful goals significantly. It's really for them, I think, about finding the importance of it in why they're even kind of open to the conversation. But scare tactics, the dare kind of philosophy that we all grew up with, doesn't necessarily work so well. So I think that a lot of what it is just trying to get them to limit use, and to have them understand, if they are choosing to use, what those choices could do. Because if you do see a result from use, you can then tie it back together if you've already planted that seed.
So excellent. Thank you so much. I do clinical and prevention, no matter what. Could you give us some, maybe a little stories about those that have had psychotic experiences after, whether they've been short-term or ongoing, just that we could give some examples without being frightening, but just kind of being informative. I love how you're saying it, because fear doesn't work.
Yeah, it's so hard. I've seen kids that, although they have family trees that probably they may have gone on to having a bipolar disorder or a schizophrenia, they densely use cannabis in those periods where they start to get a little bit psychotic, because they can't really deal with what's going on in their mind. And they try and use it, and they try and quiet, and they try and distract. And all it does is amplify it because it's psychoactive. And then they end up kind of pulled out of society in a way that they didn't intend. They end up with us on an inpatient unit, either adolescent or right at 18. And then the choices aren't theirs anymore. And so one of the things that I work with teenagers whenever I talk with them about addiction is, the more that they choose substances, the less choices that they have available for them to make in other realms. And so if they want all the opportunities for choices, they have to consider what will set them up for that. But there are people that I have seen that they have what's called, I actually had this 18-year-old girl. She was so lovely. She was smoking a ton of pot. She went to 1 ER, had a completely psychotic, but stable. They gave her like a little bit of meds. She stabilized overnight. She looked okay. Parents took her home. Same thing happened 2 days later. She smoked pot again, ER again. The next time, a week later, she smoked pot again. She went to an ER in New York and was held for a couple of days. They put her on the psych unit, but she reconstituted quick because she's a smart girl. She had a great, brain. She came out, she smoked again. She spent a week with us on inpatient. She was completely psychotic. She ended up going to one of our residential programs for substances because I literally said to her, I said, the only thing I can do to protect your mental health is to have you understand that cannabis can't be a part of your life anymore. And I often liken it. This is like, I've done this for, I've been an addiction psychiatrist for a decade, and I've done this with different age groups, but I tell them it's like lactose, right? Like we all know somebody that's lactose intolerant. Lactose, by and large, I'm not going to comment on whether or not it's good or bad, but I know for some people, they can't tolerate it and they can't use it. And it wreaks havoc on their GI tract. And, the person that's lactose intolerant, they'll have that bowl of ice cream, they're running to the bathroom. It's the same way with cannabis and people that have negative experiences with it. Once you've had one negative experience, you have to pay attention. It means something lives in your brain. And the more times you do it, the more destruction you're causing. And so it's not something to villainize the person that has that reaction. It's just people are unique. And some people can take lactose, some people can smoke pot and be fine. But if you're one of those people that can't, you have to pay attention to it. Those are the thing. That's the thing I think where a lot of the education could be with these kids is A, knowing their family history, knowing if they have bipolar schizophrenia or anybody that's been psychotic in the family tree, and B, paying attention. If they smoke pot one night and they get so paranoid that all their friends go out and they stay in, that's a red flag right there. That's somebody that you have to pay attention to because they really, really shouldn't use again.
Very helpful. Thank you. I never thought of the family history piece. I'm always saying it about alcohol, but I never say it about mental health pieces.
I mean, there are two things for the family history. There's a family history of psychosis or bipolar means that they really shouldn't smoke pot, but then a family history of addiction, if they have alcohol, if they have anything else, means that they may have an unhealthy relationship with pot, which even if they don't have a positive family history for the psychosis, if you smoke it enough, it's psychoactive. It still could lead to something that didn't live there. So both of them would be relevant questions.
Amy, I did want to just ask one thing. I know I've talked to parents who hear about cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. That's the one where people just can't stop vomiting, right? And they can end up with basically an eating disorder equivalent. I've heard parents go, why isn't everyone talking about this? Like that seems to make an impact on them. Is that something that you found that teens respond to in any way?
No, really don't. They don't even notice it, honestly. Like they don't connect the dots. We do. They'll be like, oh, like I stopped smoking and I'm puking a lot. And it's like, well, that's because your body went into this response where if you didn't have it, it's like a withdrawal. We also don't talk about when people go into cannabis withdrawal, they get really irritable. They have these vivid dreams. There's a ton of things that happen that identifies for us that the body was actually physiologically dependent on it, but the teens don't make that connection. And so I think that one of the things, honestly, for me, teens, they don't realize how good they have it or how easily they sleep often. And having them understand that when they are smoking cannabis, I think that they're actually disrupting their ability to sleep later in life. But I think that that's actually probably more relevant. The cannabis hyperemesis syndrome really doesn't have, I've seen maybe under 10 patients in over a decade with it. It's more likely that a teenager has a comorbid eating disorder, and typically cannabis quiets their distress around their relationship with food. And so they don't see it as much and it isn't as relevant. And then when they're sober, the relationship with food becomes more prominent and salient.
Thank you for that. I didn't realize that the hyperemesis syndrome was actually related to withdrawal specifically. I thought it was just something you could have as you were using.
No, so we see it when people get hospitalized for other things. All of a sudden they start vomiting a lot. And then they have to take a shower and the shower quiets it. And it's like, oh, that's what it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I think just a final kind of closing question, because we really, really appreciate your time, and thank you to Silver Hill for providing you. But I'm thinking for those of us who are related to any kind of clinical work, when we encounter youth or families who have youth that have, an addiction to cannabis, is there any specific treatment recommendation you have? Any cannabis support or withdrawal groups that for teens? Or is it just kind of go to counseling like for any other disorder?
I think right now I don't actually know of any support groups, but it is something we're in talks with at our campus about how to support it because it is something that is so important to get back to the community is having them a place to talk about it. Honestly, for clinical practice, your biggest problem is going to be the parents. These kids aren't doing it with parents that are against it typically. They're doing it and they're saying, why are you telling me to stop? Dad smokes, mom smokes. Which is honestly the scenario I had with this kid, this 14-year-old kid. He finally said to me, he's like, but dad smokes all the time. And so I had to kind of educate the parents that if we, the parents and us, are taking a hard line saying cannabis isn't good for you, then I'm not governing this parent. He can do whatever he wants in, not in front of his kid, but the kid can't see it anymore because it's very, very hard for him to see that and think, why can you do that and I can't? So I think working with the parents in how to build a structure at home that's conducive to a change is probably your biggest bang for your buck.
Thank you. Any final comments or questions for Amy?
Hear about that a lot either with cannabis, and you had a little part there about the number of overdoses. I just wondered if Amy, you could talk a little bit more about that and what you see.
And this is Amy right now. I'm showing, I don't know if you heard the question about
I couldn't hear the
ODs,
question.
and it's the second slide I'm showing. So just for everyone to make sure you saw, the first slide was all ages and the second one is 10 to 19-year-olds. And at the bottom, it's suspected overdose from cannabis.
Yeah, so I actually wondered when we're saying suspected overdose, what are we saying? They're so high that they're paranoid, they're so high that they're sedated. I actually was kind of thinking in my head, like what would bring someone to an ED and then saying that it's an overdose? Because cannabis doesn't typically, when not laced with something, doesn't typically produce a sedation that would necessitate medical care. So it makes me worried that cannabis could have been laced with a fentanyl. Which we do see. And I saw it I used to work in New York for, over a decade before this. So that's actually made me more concerned, that somewhere in the supply in the 2023 year, something was not good in this area. Because I wouldn't expect cannabis overdose to be a discharge diagnosis.
So these aren't necessarily discharge diagnoses because epicenter it's like syndromic surveillance. So it's delving into people's notes and everything else and looking at all the possibilities. But I would say, I don't know, we don't have a lot of folks here from the schools, but I know like in Norwalk Public Schools, I mean, if kids green out, which is what they call it, which they don't think is serious, but like you'll have a kid basically passing out in school sometimes, and then the schools will call it an overdose and they'll send 911. I don't know if any of the officers want to speak to that, but I know that's kind of the schools are looking at that as kind of an overdose, like the kid passed out and was transported.
Yeah.
And to your point, also Norwalk found fentanyl in a lot of marijuana products at a vape shop this summer. So
yeah, I mean, it's awful. And that's another thing that kids don't realize. They think they're like, they'll tell me, oh, when I do cocaine, I test it for fentanyl. I said, what about your pot? And they say, what do you mean? And I said, pot can be laced with fentanyl too. And they just don't have the awareness. It's, the naivety of adolescence, unfortunately, works against them. But I do think that there has to, when you see trends kind of like this, it does look like 2023 was an interesting year for cannabis in the area.
Well, thank you so much. Can we give Amy a round of applause? And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you guys for having me. And I'm always available if you guys have any questions or need any, recommendation support, want to talk through anything else, I'm happy to help.
Thank you very much. We'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
Take care.